All right, welcome. This is Book Sandwiched In. I'm Rory Martorana. I'm an adult services librarian here at the New Haven Free Public Library. Before we begin, I would like to thank my department for your support, especially Adult Services Supervisor Seth Godfrey, and my programming partner for Book Sandwiched In, Isaac Shub, who is also doing tech support for us behind the scenes today, as well as Gina Bingham, our public service administrator, for her constant support and mentoring. Today, we're joined by two incredible authors and activists, Janara Nirenberg and Melody Moezzi. Janara is the founder of the Neurodiversity Project and also a journalist, producer, and speaker, and the author of the book that we are here for today, which is Divergent Mind. If you can see it, oh, my camera's a little blurry. Thriving in a World That Wasn't Designed for You. Our special guest host today is Melody Moezzi. Melody is an activist, attorney, professor, and award-winning author. Melody's also written a series of very acclaimed titles. Her latest book, The Roomie Prescription, How an Ancient Poet Changed My Manic Life. You should pick up. That's a good one. To our Zoom viewers, if you have questions during today's discussion, feel free to enter them in the chat. You can also put them in the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to ensure they don't get lost in the fold. If you're watching us on the live stream on Facebook today, just leave us a comment with your questions and we'll try to get those answered as well. And without further ado, Melody, I will let you take it away.
Of course I'm muted. All right, am I unmuted? All right, I said so many brilliant things in that time. Thank you so much for having us. I am so excited to be here to talk about this amazing book, Divergent Mind, Thriving in a World That Wasn't Designed for You, because I am a person who is thriving in a world that wasn't designed for me. So when I saw this book, when I learned about this book, it just screamed out to me. I have bipolar disorder. I'm an Iranian American, as Rory mentioned, living in America during what is now thankfully over, known as the Trump era. And so that's when this book came out, Janara, in the middle of all of that, during the pandemic. And I just want to start off saying, how are you doing? As somebody who also had a book come out during the pandemic, it's been tough. How has that gone for you?
Yeah, thank you, Melody. I'm so happy to be here talking with you. Again, I always love chatting with you. And thank you, Rory, and to the library for having us. Yeah, I think I'm doing okay. You know, now we're kind of sort of emerging out of the whole, pandemic phase. We still have a ways to go, obviously, but it was an interesting year. And I think for many neurodivergent people, the year was mixed, right? Sort of this quiet solitude was a very interesting time for many of us. I'm really glad that the book, reached so many readers. So today we're celebrating the paperback. It came out in hardcover, a year ago in March, which was bizarre timing, but the book is making its way, and I'm so glad.
Yeah, me too. I really, I think the work that you do with the Neurodiversity Project, with the Interracial Project, that's something I just wanted to start off for those who might not be interested, who might not be knowledgeable and might be very interested in the work that you're doing with both of the projects. If you could tell us a little bit about the projects and how the readers can connect with that as well.
Yeah, totally. Thanks for asking. So the Neurodiversity Project started about 4 years ago in Berkeley, California, and it was sort of the nexus of personal and professional for me. I'm a journalist, and I was kind of figuring out what was going on with me and my sort of like mental makeup. I started getting small groups together to talk about neurodiversity, and then I started inviting authors in to kind of share their research from different perspectives and angles, and it grew. So we have live events in San Francisco, and we had a conference, and now we're doing a lot of it on Instagram, actually, for anyone who wants to follow along. And then last year at the start of the pandemic, before the horrific incident with George Floyd, I sat down with my family. We're an interracial family, and I grew up in an interracial family in a very multiracial setting, like my neighborhood and my school. And I was like, I think this is an interesting sort of nexus, like interracial life, love, friendship, intimacy, like doesn't really get examined much. And so I started reaching out to other writers again to see like, should we talk about this? So we're doing that on Instagram as well. We have a lot of like filmmakers and writers and actors who are just unpacking like interracial life, because it's something that doesn't get talked about as much. So so we're kind of at the beginning of that as well. So for anyone who wants to check out both of those work, Instagram is the place right now.
Okay, thank you. So we spoke a little bit before in preparation for this, and you were talking about the idea of media representations around disability and neurodivergence and mental health conditions. And as you well know, they're pretty notoriously garbage. So I wanted to ask, do you see that changing? And if so, who's leading that change, and how do you see it getting better? Because it's still pretty bad.
Yeah, I'm so intrigued by this topic of, like media representation, how mental illness, neurodivergence, disability more broadly, how it gets portrayed in the media. I have a longstanding interest in film and theater and things like this. So I think you see this with many different groups, right? Like marginalized groups. What happens is there are stereotypes that are in the public imagination that have to do with social norms. And then you see these same stereotypes depicted on screen. And it's sort of this constant conversation, this dynamic between what's happening on the ground and then what's happening in the media. And so something like neurodivergence, mental illness, disability is no exception. So, I've been digging into this research. So it turns out that like film close-ups tend to be like much more intense on characters that have mental illness.
Yeah.
People who are depicted as mentally ill are way more likely to be depicted as violent, much more so than actual occurrences in real life. And so I think it's something that we need to work against. And I know, Melody, your work is such an amazing contribution to all of this. And I didn't get into that too much in the book, a little bit at the end with resources and stuff, but the book is really all about reframing our conceptions of what it means to be mentally different. So whether it is autism or ADHD or, bipolar, how can we take ownership of that narrative again, and then ultimately change the public conversation?
Yeah, and I think one of the things I wanted to bring up is so I initially read the book on Kindle. So I have 61 highlights on my Kindle. So I have all my like Kindle printouts. But at the ending, there was just this really prescient moment where you talk about the field of medicine needs an overhaul. This is on page 212. With the number of people experiencing loneliness on the rise, more people become ill and turn to doctors, who are thus put in the position of needing to figure out people's social lives. But doctors are getting burned out and also need support and others to turn to, and the cycle goes on. Without people being able to open up, share, and connect with others about their internal lives, nothing will change. And you go on and talk about connection and the importance of that. And I just thought it was so prescient in terms of like, you didn't know this was coming out during the midst of a pandemic, right? But and that was part of having read it during the pandemic initially, that I found really comforting in terms of the reminders. And I found there was a lot of this that isn't overtly spiritual, but I feel like was really spiritually connected. And now knowing you and being friends with you, like I know that comes from somewhere. But I read that so much of that in here, and I thought of like, we're healthier the more connected we are. And so having been so disconnected for so long, how you see that evolving.
You mean like how we're going to emerge from the pandemic?
Yeah. Like, and I mean, just, and in some ways, neurodivergent people have been good at this in a way, like in terms of, being familiar with a kind of disconnection that maybe people who don't have that kind of makeup were not quite so familiar with being that disconnected. You know what I mean? And I think we've been forced to be disconnected because society was not exactly, we're living in a world that wasn't built for us and structured for us. And in some ways, I've found personally that the pandemic wasn't quite as hard on me as it may have been on some more neurotypical people, because for them it was a shock. And for me, it was like, yeah, I'm alone. Okay, like I've experienced, it's called depression. I've been here. Nice to meet you. Not my first rodeo on this, but yeah. So I mean, like there are lessons that neurodivergent people have been able to teach for those who are going through the pandemic, who for whom it was a real shock. So I just wanted, and I know you've had such a great response since the release of the book, and now that the paperback is out, just have you heard from people who are just like me, just incredibly grateful that this came out? And I know it wasn't great for you, but I think it came out in the perfect moment that it needed to come out, because I think it helped not just those of us who are dealing with neurodivergence, but a lot of people who are thrown into this kind of loneliness and disconnectedness inadvertently and had no control over that.
Yeah, I think it's such interesting points you're making. I think, yeah, I mean, a lot of people are finding the book because, maybe they've read articles or they've seen other research about, particularly about how women are being left out, and a lot of research regarding neurodiversity. It's interesting. I don't know if the pandemic is allowing more people to dive into this material, because I think, like you were saying, since so many of us kind of live this way anyways and are sort of outside all the time, I mean, like yourself, I'm a writer and I'm just like home, like I'm just in my head and I'm always like thinking, and that's kind of like normal for me. So yeah, I think, but I do think what you're saying about maybe people who aren't neurodivergent are finding much more like understanding about their family members, their colleagues, their kids, their parents. I'm hearing from a lot of people who are saying like tears streaming down their faces because in hindsight, they're realizing that one of their parents, who maybe is no longer alive, had X, Y, and Z. And, it's such a like healing experience to be able to put like a name to that. Yeah. And then in terms of like how we're going to emerge from this whole pandemic period, I think, I mean, I do really hope that all of us are able to take some of the lessons and things we've learned around what it means to live more quiet, or not be like rushing around in this like aggressive state all the time, which I think many neurodivergent people are, we wish for the world anyways. Actually, I wrote something in the book and we put it up in a quote card, and I really couldn't believe how much it captured this moment. And I'm going to paraphrase my own quote, but I wrote something like, I look forward to the day when what is considered a, like, oh God, what it was. Let me grab it really quick, because I think, obviously we didn't anticipate this happening in the context of a pandemic, but I think many neurodivergents, were in a way hoping that the world would one day quiet down. Okay, so here it is. So I look forward to the day when what is currently a hidden sensory world for many people becomes the global norm. What are labeled as sensory ailments actually hold promise for healing a fractured and traumatized world that is in desperate need of repair. So yeah, so I mean, I was meditating about these topics, for the last several years, like many of us, and in a way that, the pandemic did force like sort of this quieting down thing. Obviously, it's not in the way that we wanted at all, but so perhaps it has people thinking.
Yeah. I mean, So at the beginning of the book, you note this concept of like how we need to start reconsidering what it means to be human, which really drew me in really quickly. You talk about how knowing that neurodivergent, this is a quote directly from the book, how does knowing that neurodivergent people make up at least 20% of the population begin to shift our concept of normal, disordered, or mentally ill? Perhaps we were really talking about humanity as a whole rather than a set of neurotypical versus neurodivergent individuals. Given that so many neurodivergent people go undiagnosed, we may be looking at an entirely different concept of what it means to be human. Like, that's so exciting to me. Because I feel like that different concept, you're speaking for so many people in saying that, like, that's not, because in understanding that different concept, like, what doors does that open for people who have been shut out before? You know what I mean?
Yeah. So I have been thinking about this a lot lately. I think it's interesting because, the deeper you get into like neurodiversity research or talking with neurodivergent people and interviewing neurodivergent people, I don't know if it's just me because that's like my world and I just see everything through that lens and through that kind of that color. It actually becomes more difficult to see neurotypicality, to be honest, because you like also the more you talk to people and people open up with you and kind of like take off their masks and like remove all those layers, you start realizing like some of these things are very universal, and so I think that's important for people to know. And the reason why we don't currently see the world in that way is because we have this culture of being really closed off, right? And people are not encouraged to talk about their mental health or their emotional health or challenges, or needing to see the doctor for something, right? We just don't have that in our culture. But imagine if it was more open, right? Would we be at a point where we wouldn't even need this kind of terminology of normal or abnormal,
Yeah.
or neurotypical or neurodivergent? So I believe that is the direction we're heading in, and we will get there someday. And so a lot of us who are, activists and advocates and writers in the neurodiversity space are in some ways, we're kind of in the early helm of this kind of thinking. And yeah.
Yeah, which makes me think about like the labeling, like just there's a part of the book where you note that being able to finally give a name to an experience is healing and liberating, right? At the beginning. And then toward the end, you say, once I embraced my own labels, categories, and identifications, I mean, truly embrace them and got my family, friends, and colleagues on board, I almost didn't need them anymore. Once I learned about them, I adjusted. We all adjusted. And now I have a thriving life, meltdowns and all, which I love. But this idea that like embracing the labels makes you not need, which is exactly what my experience has been, to find the labels incredibly liberating at first, and then just to be like, what does this really mean? And I'm wondering what that progression has been like for you. And you write a bit about it in the book for sure, but since the book's release, because I think you're providing a different outlet for other people to see this and see themselves reflected in the book, not through just your own experience, but all the incredible research that you do to put this together, which is based on your ability to hyper focus, right? Like, I'm so grateful for your ability to hyper focus because you managed to put all this material together in a way that was so not just easily digestible, but entertaining. So yeah, I'm curious about this idea of labels and how much of it is liberating, and then when does it stop being liberating, and when does it just no longer necessary, and how that has been for you and how it has been in terms of how readers have responded.
Yeah. Thanks so much for, finding that thread. And it's so cool to hear how it resonates for you and hopefully everyone who's watching and listening. But yeah, I tend to describe this as like, the labels are entry points. They're entryways, right? They're entryways to, empowerment, liberation, knowledge, just being informed. And I talk a lot about that in the book, about just like the real importance of just knowledge and information. And for me, I find that, so healing, just to kind of grab onto something and be like, okay, I got it. And then you kind of like absorb it, right? And so I think for many neurodivergent people who are kind of discovering aspects of themselves, and maybe they're jumping into some of the advocacy and activism, in the neurodiversity movement, it's something that's like very exciting, and it's really important work. And then like the quote you're reading, once it gets integrated into your life and to all aspects of your life, like your family and your work and your sense of identity, you just don't, it's just something that doesn't need to be even said as much, because it's just a part of you, and people know it. And then it's, again, this word is like integration. So it's not to say that those things aren't important. And I think everyone has their own journey with this. And I really do encourage people to just do what works for them. I think some people continue on, like they really kind of find like a new line of work or like a fight around this particular label or diagnosis. For other people, it just gets integrated and they just kind of, they just continue living their lives, and they just have a different perspective and a different shift, about how they see themselves. Yeah. So I think, for me personally, it was a journey of like learning about neurodiversity, the movement. I had been thinking about this kind of approach and philosophy for a while, and I didn't have the word for it. So that was exciting. And then learning about how women were left out of the research on autism and ADHD. And then, really focusing on this trait of sensitivity and how it was so prevalent, for people, no matter what your label or diagnosis was. And then in the book, I also talk about synesthesia, which is, this fascinating trait of senses getting crossed. And then there was like a process of opening up about all of this to my family and to, people I worked with. And then, certainly the book coming out was very healing too. It was kind of like a release, like I'm releasing this to the world. And now it's been a year, and I think it's awesome seeing how people respond, and everyone has a different story and entryway to the book. It's for themselves or their parents or a sibling. I hear from a lot of therapists actually who are saying how much it's impacting their practice, and they recommend it to their clients, which is really exciting because we want to see change, in the therapeutics industry. And then it's also allowed me to kind of move on to other things, right? I'm a journalist, and we've got the interracial project going, and so no matter what I do in my life and professionally, the neurodiversity work is such a huge part, but it just gets integrated into whatever I do next, and so I think that's also exciting for people to know, for everyone who's watching and listening. In your own life, you'll have different periods of discovery and integration, and so and that's okay too. It's okay for this to become part of your larger story, and you're not going to leave it behind, because I feel like some people feel like they have to kind of keep sticking with this one movement or something. I don't know if you felt that way.
No, I feel that way completely. Yeah, that you're stuck in that definition of what you initially saw that diagnosis as, that label really meaning, and what it actually means later on, once that shame and stigma is no longer with it. And for me, as somebody like you who's written about it, once you write about it, you're public, it's out there. There's no one can out you, you know what I mean? You're already out, and you're owning it, and not just owning it, but helping other people. And again, like, not just be like, we don't share the same diagnosis, but I saw myself in this book so much. And I'm so grateful to what you did, because it wasn't just, this was the best book that I read all of 2020. And it was the best book. And I'm so grateful to you for it, because it wasn't just that book. It's everyone you cited in the book. It was every other book I read because of the book. Joyful, like that. I loved that book. Like the other books that you cite in the other writers, often women, right? Like who have written really important work, and you dig into that research in a way that like is much easier for me to get a broad sense of what's happening within this movement that I have been in for so long and yet have never seen a book like this. So that's partly why I was so grateful for it. The chat is like blowing up, so I'm going to ask some of the questions.
Sure.
So what are some ways neurodivergent people can engage with meditation practices and body awareness practices that honor how overwhelming tuning into the internal sensory experiences interoception can be? I recall you naming that a lot of traditional approaches to mindfulness and internal awareness aren't often very accessible to neurodivergent folks, and I'm curious about new approaches.
Yeah, that's a great question. So yeah, I don't focus on meditation a lot in the book. And honestly, in my own life, I'm a movement person. And I think you are too, Melody. Like the types of meditation I've always been drawn to are more like Tai Chi and Qigong. And I love to dance and run. And so for me, all of that is far more healing than just like planting myself and sitting. And I hear this all the time from other neurodivergent people that just, straight up like mindfulness meditation does not work for them. So, yeah, so I don't know how to totally answer the question, but I would just say, I would encourage people to not feel like they have to stay inside a box or of what they think meditation is supposed to be. Because as neurodivergent people, we know that so many mainstream things don't work for us. And so, yeah, that's what I would say.
Yeah. Oh, that's a great answer. And for me, yeah, hula hooping is my meditation. So I'm not staying still at all, for sure. There's another question here that says a lot of teachers, psych professionals and parents tend to tell me I'm wrong when I speak about my own autistic experience because they learned it a different way, or that the research says something else. How would you suggest responding in those situations? How can I make people understand that all the research in the world doesn't match an actual autistic or otherwise neurodivergent person's experience? It sometimes feels like my self-advocacy falls on deaf ears.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I hear that all the time. And I think, again, like we're kind of in the beginning of a lot of this, especially in terms of, representation of women and girls. And so this is why I think it's important to sort of take the narrative into your own hands, for one. The second thing is that I don't believe that formal diagnosis is necessary or even important, to be honest. I think like if we're working with a medical industry that is based on research that is literally 30 years old, because it takes about 20 to 30 years for the research to get integrated into practice, then how can you let those people tell you who you are or who you aren't? So I think that's really huge. And you will find many people out there who are self-identified. I mean, as I write in the book, I did not go the formal diagnostic route because of what I'm talking about. That being said, for some people, it's hugely important and it makes sense. You need it for accommodations in the classroom and at work. So it just really depends on your particular individual situation. So yeah, again, we're just at the beginning, but for the person who asked the question, just know that there are so many people out there like us.
Yeah, great answer. There's another question for both of us. What helped you integrate your labels? Do you have recommendations for supporting someone who is beginning that process of integrating the different aspects of neurodivergence?
You want to go first?
Sure. What helped me integrate my labels was people, and this answers the other part of the question too, just people saying you're the same person. There was a moment where I actually told my husband, like, you can leave. Like, if I could leave me right now, I would leave me. And him being able to say, you were crazy from day one. This is not a new development for you. Now you have a label for it, but you're not a different person. That was one of the things that was most helpful to me. How about you, Janara?
Yeah, that's interesting. What helped me integrate it? I mean, it's a gradual process, you know. I think, well, like in the beginning for me, it was like a lot of light bulb moments. And like I remember the day that this research was popping up in my Facebook feed of all places about how women were being left out and the research on autism and ADHD. And then I read these things and I was like, this captures me to a T. Like, how come I've never heard of this? You know, and so there's those initial moments of like, oh my gosh. Um, and then, you know, just being a very curious person, being a journalist and a writer, you know, then you've got that thread of like, okay, let me dive into this. What is this all about? Let me find out what's going on. I need to learn more and more and more. And so there's sort of that initial period of discovery. And then, like I said, it's gradual. Like, I mean, I think I took it one step at a time, right? It's like absorbing the information, then slowly opening up to like family and friends, then getting more serious about it. Well, for me, you know, that's how the book was born. You know, Divergent Mind came out of this whole process of discovery. And then you just get more and more comfortable, you know, like as you're more open, like we were just saying a few minutes ago, it just becomes integrated into your life. And so the more that you can stay grounded in like your own knowledge of who you are and, you know, present that face to the world and to the people around you, then it will just naturally get integrated.
Yeah. There's a question here from Adrian who says, what suggestions do you have for gaining accommodations at work? And I would say like the same applies for students at school as well, but more importantly, educating our doctors on what our neurodiversity is really like. I.e., it is not like one page on their textbook, but far more complex than what they read in their textbooks, for instance. Yeah.
Yes. I think accommodations are an interesting topic. In the book, I focus on the topic of work a lot because I think it's just such an important site and place of like agency, right? You know, you're in the world, you're interacting with other people, it's your source of income and how you know, take care of yourself and your family. So Margot Joff, who's at Verizon now, and everyone should look her up if you don't already know her. You know, in the book, we talked about things, you know, the usual things like where to sit in the office and having headphones and things like that. But I think more importantly, it's like the communication that happens, like, you know, making sure that your boss and colleagues like understand you and like where you can just kind of share what you need or what you can't do. And so that to me seems like the really important piece, you know, because then you'll feel able to be yourself and to ask for what you need. And there's, you know, another thing I talked about in the book and elsewhere is the importance of acceptance. When people who are autistic or neurodivergent feel really accepted, both by themselves and by the people around them, their levels of like depression and anxiety go way down, right? So that also means that you'll be able to just do your work better, right? If you're feeling better. So again, I think that communication piece is really important. I would love to see schools and universities and workplaces have, you know, just really introductory neurodiversity trainings for everyone. I don't think it requires that much. I mean, people need to be educated and the information needs to be out there. So I definitely recommend that. And, you know, some places are doing that, some of the bigger companies, but it needs to be more commonplace.
Yeah, and I think the more of us who are in different industries, the better that becomes. Like I provide accommodations for all of my students, whether or not, like some of them, their disabilities, they don't want to go to the Disability Resource Center and say, this is my disability. Can you provide this accommodation? Because the stigma surrounding whatever that disability is, for instance. And I think they find that like other professors are willing to provide accommodations. They don't necessarily have to go that legal specific route to get those accommodations.
Yeah.
So there's another question here from Sarah who asks, what is your vision for evolving treatment and support for the neurodiverse community?
Well, I mean, so everyone probably knows, like, so the word treatment is like a little tricky because, you know, we don't want to get into like cure talk and fixing talk and things like that. So if we're talking about, you know, practices that just support well-being, like that's a great conversation to have. So in terms of the evolution of where that's all going, I mean, I interviewed a lot of therapists for the book. And so, you know, Grace Malinois, who's here in California, she's great. And she, you know, she makes sure that there are no like there's no food in the office, for example. So that's like, you know, people's senses aren't getting overwhelmed. She keeps all the lights like very low. She even has like, she makes sure that the fan and the ventilation are not too loud. And then she also keeps like soft materials. So she's like very attentive, you know, to what would feel therapeutic. Again, for an adult, which is really important, right? Because a lot of the neurodiversity conversation is on kids and also on boys. And so it's so encouraging now that we have practitioners who are really seeing the adult population. So yeah, and then, I mean, honestly, I feel like a lot of neurodivergent people kind of find their own like hodgepodge of like wellness, or like they kind of have to put something together. I mean, like Melody, like for you and I mean, like it sounds like we both love like dance and movement, and that helps us feel grounded and like, you know, regulated and that kind of thing. Again, for me, I spend a lot of time in nature. I'm like always going on walks and hikes, and then certainly a sort of classic therapist can be helpful. But again, if the therapist is not informed around like sensory stuff and neurodiversity stuff, there's going to be limitations. And then, you know, I'm intrigued by some of the like somatic practitioners out there, but again, I feel like a lot of somatic practitioners don't know that much about the whole like neurodiversity perspective. And something I'm extremely cautious of that I want everyone to know is that there is an element in the kind of like somatic world where people want to pin everything to like trauma, and where they just want to say like, oh, you're having this because of X, and this thing needs to be looked at, and like, you know, and I just like really disagree with that. And I think that that's like quite horrible. And I actually, there's kind of a resistance in some of that therapeutic community because they've been trained really to only see things through the lens of trauma. And so I think that's dangerous. I really do. And so I want to caution people to, if you know, encounter that, to know that that actually is a bit extremist, and that's something that we want to push against. And in the book Divergent Mind, I start off by looking at the history of psychiatry and the history of psychology and all the errors that were made when people did become so fundamentalist, you know, and wanting to pin everything on one aspect of one's life or existence. And that's the kind of thing that we just really want to get away from. And is also why I feel so strongly that individuals can, you know, again, put together their own narrative or pieces that they truly find helpful and healing, and not to kind of just submit to one system. Yeah. I hope this all makes sense.
It makes so much sense. And I mean, would you say that the book itself is you creating that own narrative for yourself? Like that, I sensed you throughout the book being like, you know, some people benefit from cognitive behavioral therapy. I was someone who didn't benefit quite that much from it, as you maybe not quite as much as well as you noted. But knowledge, like actually research, the stuff that is so frequently pathologized, the things that we do to learn about ourselves that, you know, and I hear doctors sometimes saying things like, you know, don't Google it, don't like, and I'm not saying Google is the best place, but like read a book. Like this book was so therapeutic to me. And I think people forget that. And so was the book therapeutic to you in terms of being the writer? Was this part of your finding that narrative for yourself as well?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think I was just talking with Steve Silverman the other day, who people probably know. He's the author of Neurotribes, and we were talking a bit about my journey. And and I was saying how, writing this book was kind of like an investigative journey. I mean, I'm a journalist, and so this was my chance to dive in. And so it very much was this simultaneous process of like, okay, I'm on this journey of like discovery. I'm going to figure out what I need to know and what's empowering for me. And yes, like what is it? What's the story that I, need to like reclaim? And then how can all of this information help everyone else out there who's on the same journey, because there's so many of us out there. And and so that's what came out, is just this personal story, and a real hope for other people to find their own sort of healing journey.
If I could just jump in, and this is a question for both of you. Do you have, aside from Neurotribes, which actually has been on my reading list for a while, do you guys have any other recommendations of books that people can read that are, up to date and reflect more accurately the experience of being neurodivergent than necessarily like a psychological textbook or something more scientific?
Yeah, Melody, do you have a few in mind?
Yeah, so you can actually go to Janara's Twitter feed and you will find a list that she has put together. And I'm not just saying that because my latest book is on that list, I promise. But Janara's put together actually a really stellar list that I'll retweet right now while Janara answers that question.
Oh, thank you, Melody. That's so sweet. Yes, it's true. On Twitter, I do often like shout out other books, and at the top of my Twitter, I just put together like a list, and a lot of people seem to really appreciate it. These were books actually that came out in 2020 alone. They were all written by neurodivergent authors and in different fields, right? And that's what we love to see, right? I mean, we want this information. Yes, it needs to be in the realm of psychology, but there's a chef on there, there's an academic on there, there's a virtual reality expert on there. That's what we want to see. We want to see neurodiversity knowledge and expertise integrated into the wider world. So yeah, in terms of my recommendations on top of what I've shared on Twitter, I actually think so. Maya Dusenberry, she wrote the book Doing Harm, and her book is all about gender bias in medicine, and that focuses more on like autoimmune issues. But it's just a really important work. And then I always recommend Nick Walker. And Nick has done a lot of blog pieces actually around neurodiversity terminology and sort of like changing our perspective within psychology. And then I always recommend Neurotribes, and there's a lot, and I do list several in this book as well. So yeah.
Thanks, Rory. Do you want to go? Can we go to the other questions? There's a bunch more. There's not going to be enough time to go through all of them. But did you pick some, Rory, or do you want me to?
You can start. I'm always like muted when I don't think I am.
Yeah.
You can start. You can pick one to start, and then I'll look through.
Sure. I haven't read through all of them, but there's one here about gradually integrating my labels while including others. However, it feels like I am becoming more of a target at work. It doesn't help that my psychiatrist believes in increasing drugs as a quote fix. How do I avoid becoming a target? I thought that was an interesting question.
That's very interesting. And I don't have like all the information to know exactly what it means, like to be a target. Like, I don't know if you're talking about workplace bullying or, someone kind of using a neurodivergent person as a scapegoat, which, is horrible. So yeah, I mean, if you're able to try different psychiatrists, I mean, that can really make all the difference, right? And again, unfortunately, since a lot of this information is so new and it's not integrated, it can be helpful to kind of do your own research. And I mean, a lot of even like medical papers are available online. And I know people who literally have to do that. It can actually also be helpful to literally like take Divergent Mind with you, like to your therapist's office or to your psychiatrist's office, which I've heard of people doing, to just be like, hey, look, there's like research behind all of this, and like, you need to know what this is about. So yeah, so that's a kind of a hard and tricky question to answer without having all of the information, but check out different psychiatrists if possible. And in terms of the workplace question, bringing the book to work.
Yeah. And, I think, I don't know if ProPublica keeps it up, but they have a list where you can, in ProPublica, put in different psychiatrists and see whether or not how much money they take from big pharma. This is the person asking about drugs as effects. Right. So you can see how much money they're getting from big pharma, thanks to ProPublica, at least last I checked. There's a great question here about whether you're offering training sessions or if you have a group that you would recommend in terms of formal neurodiversity training.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, there's different kinds of neurodiversity training, so it depends on the specifics. I certainly, will give talks and, do events like this. And I've offered a few classes in the past. And yeah, it really depends. But people can reach me. My website is divergentlit.com, and I have like a contact there. So yeah, I just heard from someone this morning who wants me to share some of this perspective at like, more academic conference, which again is really exciting. I would love for this information to be able to penetrate different fields, right? So yeah, feel free to reach out to me on my website.
Thanks. I'm pasting Janara's list right now. Marie McDaniel, I see your question right there. So I'm just pasting, you said you're not on Twitter. So I've just pasted the Medium piece that I was referring to into the chat. So it's right there. Yeah, there's so many questions.
There's so many questions.
Yeah.
I'm gonna get two at once because
Yeah,
they're related. Both are anonymous, but one is Melody and Janara, any plans on creating a workbook to go along with either of your books? And the other for Janara, will you be publishing a PDF of resources with the audiobook for download?
Okay, I'll just answer that one real quick, and then Melody, if you want to answer about the workbook. The audiobook is available. I haven't thought about putting a PDF together of resources. The resources section appears in the paperback, and it also appears in the ebook. So that's a great easy option. You can just download it on Kindle and Apple Books and Google Books. So yeah, so all the resources are kind of out there. It's just a matter of finding the right format. In terms of publishing a workbook to go along, Divergent Mind actually is like a kind of an interesting mix. It's journalistic and investigative, but it's also very practical and has a lot of like takeaways and things that you can integrate. So I think for Divergent Mind, this is probably kind of on its own. What about you, Melody?
For my latest book is called the Roomie Prescription, so that I'm not planning on a workbook, but I'm putting the Farsi up for anybody who speaks Farsi. We're awesome. Translating it into Farsi. So if you want the original Rumi poems from that book in Farsi will be up on my website shortly. So that's the closest thing I got to a workbook. But I would love to do something together. And I would love for you to at some point do those trainings. Like I know that you speak at conferences all the time, but God, my dream is for you to just go to every university, come to mine first, and do these trainings that are like, because you think of like official trainings, and I've been to kinds of trainings where it's like a white guy giving me diversity training, and I'm like, fine, I'm okay with that. But I feel like the people who are doing the trainings, it's too frequently, it's one thing to be well versed in something, it's another thing to identify as that thing, whether it's in relation to race or neurodiversity. And for me, I just can't buy in if somebody isn't from that community. I'm like, okay, well, you've read a lot of books, good for you, but you haven't lived it. And and that to me, for Divergent Mind, what came through is that you've lived it. And I mean, like, you can read plenty of textbooks one, just don't integrate so much material into one relatively short book to give you all of that in one place, but just don't have that perspective of recognizing that. And I mean, you were diagnosed later in life too, so that's kind of like, this is something you figured out later, and there's legitimate anger around that, like why women are not part of this in terms of anything other than just being pathologized as hysterical. Then there's not this space in order to be like, oh, you know, maybe I interpret the world differently. Maybe that's not a disorder. Maybe that's a gift, and I can figure out how to navigate the world that wasn't, again, built for you. And I saw you doing that over and over again. And that's what I think makes this book so special, among other things, is that you're coming from that perspective. You're not just coming from the outside.
Thank you. Yeah. I mean, like we were saying before, I mean, representation is huge, you know, and, you know, and that's also like a wider issue. And I'd love to see more neurodivergent creators and writers in every field. You know, we talk a lot about like tech, but I mean, I want to see like Hollywood and media and film, you know, so that we can see our stories on wider screens. That's really important. Yeah.
So you guys said earlier you're cool with staying a little later with us. Is that still the case? Maybe we can get to a couple more questions.
Yeah. And I can take like a few more. Melody, are you okay on time?
Yeah, I'm great.
I also want to say like what Melody just said. I totally agree. And I know we talked about this before we went live, but I really love this book. It might be like one of my favorite books of all time now. I've never felt so understood and so acknowledged and so validated before. And I had this sense that I'm not alone, which like I'm cracking up now, which so often happens when, you know, you read these books and they're written by professionals in the field that don't have the lived experience. They just have, you know, the academic background. And it's so different hearing from another woman who was diagnosed late, who knows what this is like. Because something, you know, when you're neurodivergent and you don't know that you're neurodivergent, you know, there's a tendency to feel very lost and very misunderstood and very off, and you don't understand what's going on. So I'm glad that you wrote this book and that you framed it in such a way like that, you know, we can acknowledge that it's not a deficiency, it is a gift. That's something like I was diagnosed autistic at 31. So, and I had a hard time accepting it at first because everything I'd read sort of implied that it was some kind of a deficit. So, and now I'm very proud of my autism, but I'm so glad you wrote this book. So hopefully other women with that experience don't have a hard time accepting things, and they can realize that it makes them more beautiful.
Thank you, Rory.
Like taking over the questions.
No. Thank you for sharing that. And that's so important. And I'm so glad to hear that, you know, that it resonated so much.
I have a question here. This is from Anonymous. Have you heard about the Next for Autism fundraiser, Color the Spectrum, with Jimmy Kimmel, Mark Rober, and a ton of celebrities? It's blowing up autistic Twitter since the organization, like Autism Speaks, is problematic in a lot of ways. So many nonprofits for neurodivergent communities and autism in particular seem to have a lot of controversy and problems, and those are typically the most well-known ones. Do you have advice for allies to navigate which organizations are actually informed by neurodivergence versus those that are perpetuating harmful stereotypes?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, like the question asker said, I mean, this tends to happen a lot, you know, like a cause will be taken up and then it gets a little controversial around like who's at the helm of this cause, you know, like a fundraising effort or an organization or a film. And so again, it goes back to what Melody and I were talking about, you know, just like representation is so huge. And I think people in the wider world need to take that really seriously. And so, yeah, I don't have like specific recommendations around like certain organizations or anything like that. I have seen a little bit of this on Twitter recently. But again, I think it just speaks to needing to shift the conversation as much as possible, to putting these kinds of efforts into the hands of people with lived experience. And I think that's just going to take time. I think the Twitter community and the neurodivergent community at large is very good at being vocal and really expressing the issues well. And so, yeah, I think, I think a lot about this kind of thing in terms of like history and looking at how things like eventually come together and get integrated into the world. And it does start with these kind of like individual actions and then collective action builds. And so I think we'll see it soon. I think we're going to be reaching, a turning point. I think it's been really exciting. Melody and I have connected recently multiple times, and there's a lot of other neurodivergent writers and creators and filmmakers and producers. And so it's just going to keep sort of pushing where more of us get to kind of help design these things. And so I would just encourage everyone to keep going.
Yeah. Go ahead, Rory. Do you have, I
was going to go into another question. So if you have
I was just about masking. You write a bunch about masking and how that's just, and I was interested in it as just an unconscious reaction to patriarchy and white supremacy that happens neurodivergent or not. Like, I just think it happens all the time, and especially with women. And I wondered just how much farther out you can take that.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Yeah, so for everyone watching or listening, so masking is, this term we use a lot in the neurodivergent community, where it's like, what does a person have to do in order to kind of get on in the world, and what kinds of things do we have to hide to kind of appear normal? And it can really take a toll on someone after a while. And it's kind of that pressure just builds up. And a lot of people end up just kind of falling apart or melting down, shutting down. And then many of us just reach a point where we're like, okay, not going to do this anymore. This is not working for me. And I totally agree. I think, so there's something I put a little bit in the afterword of the paperback print of Divergent Mind is just, the way that what we call like neuronormativity and whiteness really intersect. So what we think of as normal is often dictated by like whiteness, right? And so, this excessively proper, detached, closed off, kind of like not real energy and way of interacting with people. And there's many different words for this, right? But I find it really, really important and really critical to connect those two, because I feel like collectively, right, our country is reconciling with this, and then sort of we have these sub pockets like the neurodiversity community who are also kind of talking about this. And so there is this energy of like, well, hey, like, what is this? Like, why do we expect people to behave a certain way or act a certain way? And who decides what's normal and what's not normal? What's behind that? Is it patriarchy, white supremacy? And so I think that's a really exciting conversation. And I am excited for that to kind of be out there more. And yeah, again, I'm really excited to see where we go with this. And I think artists are going to be really important in this process. I think the more that, really creative people integrate these kinds of shifts in perspective in their work, again, in like film, media, art that's, you see in exhibits, even like social media activists, I think the more that these expectations get unpacked, then the sooner they will kind of dissolve.
So on that note, Shiloh had a question, and I'm not sure, since you're not necessarily a filmmaker, if you'll be able to answer this one, but Shiloh asked, Janara, I loved your book. I totally agree with you, both about media representation. I absolutely love so many neurodivergent individuals have beautiful ideas around a better future for humanity. How would a neurodivergent person with an idea for a sitcom on the truth of ASD that's pro neurodiversity find others to collaborate with and develop a script?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for asking it. So I actually am thinking about this a lot. I have friends who are mostly friends of color who are collaborating within Hollywood to change the narrative around race and media representation, which is so awesome. And so we've been in conversation around how to do the same for something like disability representation, mental illness representation, neurodivergence representation. So that's something that I'm actively thinking about and really excited to follow up on. I think it's going to be a gradual process. You know, it's kind of getting to know the industry better, learning, like Shiloh was saying, kind of finding people where we can all put our skills together and put our heads together around what would this look like. You know, would we have an incubator, or you know, in Hollywood, you know, they talk about like pipelines, basically like pipeline creators, like how do we make that pathway easier, I know, for people to go from story idea to being in a writer's room, you know, on set. So, you know, for people who are watching or listening, feel free to reach out, you know, if that's something, if you have experience in this industry and would like to look into that, that's something I'm thinking about a lot. You know, for anyone who's ready to jump in right now, I mean, there's always like fellowships and there's some like incubators. They're so extremely competitive, and usually you kind of have to know someone, or someone needs to put in a recommendation. So that can be a little tricky. So we'll see if we can build something.
So I want to be respectful of your time, even though you did say you can stay a little later. Maybe one more question. I'll let Melody pick it out and then we can wrap it up.
Okay. Ooh, I get to pick the last question.
Yeah. No pressure.
So here's one. I'm not particularly interested in a diagnosis, but I do want to learn more about myself. I don't think I fit into one of these labels, but your box helped me realize that my experience with anxiety, depression, sensory overloads, panic attacks, social communications issues, social confusion, etc., points to my neurodivergence. But I'm not sure about next steps. I don't need work accommodations. I have a great work setup, but what should I do to figure out my neurodivergence?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think the question is, what do you need to do? Like, is there anything to do, right? I think it really depends on the individual. Like, is someone just seeking to be better understood, to feel seen, to have, or to kind of have a name and a label just for your own self-knowledge? Then there's a lot out there, right? I mean, so there's my book, which really helps with all of that, because it just gives you a lot of information and shares stories from other women. You know, or are you looking for, you know, a certain kind of therapeutic approach for like help in your life? You know, certainly some people turn to certain kinds of therapists or even medication. I just really encourage every individual to do what works for them. So it sounds like there's something that the question asker is seeking. So maybe like get clear about what you're seeking. Are you, do you need like help with something? And, you know, how can you link with the right therapist or practitioner for that? If you're just wanting more knowledge for yourself, you know, pick up a couple more books. So yeah, it really depends. But again, like I think Divergent Mind is actually great for this kind of reader, like someone who just wants to figure stuff out and doesn't need to have like, you know, an exact like medical thing, because we're challenging that notion, right? And looking at, you know, so yeah. Thank you for all the questions, and thank you, Melody and Rory. This was really great.
It was really terrific having both of you. It's such a fascinating talk, and I don't think we talk about this enough. So it's just such an honor to host you. Just a couple housekeeping things. Both Divergent Mind and the Roomie Prescription are available here at the New Haven Public Library. If you live in New Haven, call your local branch to reserve a copy. If you're from elsewhere, we also encourage you to pick up a copy of your own. They're both great reads. This program was made possible by gifts to the New Haven Free Public Library Foundation. If you enjoyed it, please consider making a donation at nhfpl.org/donate to help support our collections, programs, and services throughout the year. And if you enjoyed it, please, if you're on Zoom, there is a brief survey at the end. We really appreciate your feedback, and we really do try to connect with authors and other guests who will accommodate what you're looking for. And just a quick reminder, join us tomorrow. Adult Services Librarian Samantha Bailey will be chatting with Catherine Alto about female poets and nature writers to honor Earth Day and Poetry Month. We also invite you to Zoom next Thursday. I will be with Wilson Branch Manager Marion Huggins as we welcome Nadia Owusu to talk about her memoir, Aftershocks. Details for all our programs are always available on our website at nhfpl.org. And again, ladies, thank you so much. This is so special. I've been looking forward to this all month, and it was really great to have you both here.